Welcome to our webinar featuring the fundamentals of media relations for counties. I'm Mark Levine, and I am the Deputy Director of your New York State Association of Counties. Our topic today will delve into how media relations have changed significantly over the years. As newsrooms have gotten smaller and social media has created intense pressure on journalists to publish news in real time and respond to public comments, people in government media relations roles need to have the knowledge and skills to assess a situation and respond quickly and smartly. In this session, you will learn tips for building positive relationships with journalists, as well as a better understanding of the modern news cycle and how to handle media proactively and reactively. Before we get started, I want to turn the mic over to Stephen Aquario, the NYSAC Executive Director. This is a topic that is close to his heart, and he's one of the best media relations people I know. Stephen.
Well, very kind of you, Mark. Thank you very much. And likewise, I'd like to compliment you, Mark. You are a true communications expert. We have done so much training, you and me, in this regard. And I think that's because we respect the media. I think we respect the function of the media in society. And I am very grateful to you, Mark. You are a doctor in communications yourself and in media relations. So thank you, Mark. But look, folks, I am so happy to be part of this here today. Sean Gilliland, the chairman of the Essex County Board of Supervisors, wrote us a note a couple of months back and said, look, we're going through some issues up here. We could use some help and how to better communicate to the public about what we do. And look, the media plays a huge role in informing the public on events, on issues happening in our government and in our community. And in particular, with respect to government, the media informs the public on these important events and issues that take place, whether it's a board meeting or a departmental meeting or policies of the government or during emergencies. But the information presented by the media will definitely affect how people act, how people think towards their government. So it's fair to say it's essential to learn to interact with the media in a professional and a responsive manner so that the public is well informed. And having a point of contact or media relations manager is an important position for government, whether you're in the rural, suburban, or urban areas of New York State. And I really want to thank Josh Papour and Charisse Wells from Corning Place Communications for joining us here today to share with us some of their expertise, some things that they've learned along the years to better serve the public. So thank you, Mark Levine, and I'll turn it over to Josh and Charisse right now. Thank you.
Hold on, before we move over to Josh, we have a few brief housekeeping announcements. Jeanette Stanziano is our Director of Education and Training. Jeanette.
Thank you, Mark. Just want to let everyone know that as with all NYSAC webinars, we are happy to be recording this session. After the program, approximately an hour afterwards, we will post the recording with a PDF of the slide deck on NYSAC's website under Archive Webinars. Just look for today's date. We also want to encourage you throughout the presentations to feel free to submit any questions that you might have for our presenters today. The way to do so is to simply refer to your dashboard of the webinar, click on the Questions tab, and type in your question at any time. Our speakers will get to the questions during a brief moderated 10 to 15 minute portion of the webinar after the presentations are complete. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Our speakers today, as Steve mentioned, are from Corning Place Communications. Now, NYSAC has worked with Corning Place on a couple of campaigns over the years. I've known Josh and Charisse for several years, and I've been in training that they have done, and it's always great. I always learn something new. So thank you both for joining us today. Josh Papour is the managing director at Corning Place Communication. He leads public affairs campaigns for clients in healthcare, tech, organized labor, higher education, and government. Before joining CPC in 2015, Josh spent 5 years with the New York State Dental Association, where he oversaw the communications and marketing efforts for the 13,000 member professional association. Prior to that, he spent 8 years at Harvard University in the Public Affairs and Communications Office, where he managed communication for several different divisions, including the Office of Sustainability and the Office of Community and Government Affairs. Charisse Wells joined Corning Place Communication in 2012 and has worked on education, delivering comprehensive advocacy campaigns, and providing strategic public affairs and media relations services. Previously, Charisse served as Deputy Press Secretary for the New York State Executive Chamber, and before that as Deputy Press Secretary for the Empire State Development, the state's chief economic development agency. Prior to working in state government, Charisse served as Communications and Web Strategies Manager for the Rensselaer County Regional Chamber of Commerce in Troy. Thank you both for joining us today, and I'd like to turn it over to Josh.
Mark, thanks so much for having us, and Stephen for the inviting us to participate. NYSEC is one of the most respected organizations in the state, particularly in the comms and media relations field, so it's an honor to be speaking with all of you today. We're going to be talking a lot about communications, media relations, and one of the key tenets of that is transparency, and that's why we have our cameras up right now, because these photos are not what we look like anymore, but we wanted to make sure that we're being honest and transparent. But we are going to shut our cameras off so you can get the full screen and see everything in the presentation. It's a pretty long slide deck, and we're going to move through it pretty quickly. All right. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So really quickly, we'll just go through the deck. Corning Place Communications, as Mark said, we've been around since 2000. We're mainly here in Albany, but we work across the state with all different groups. And our main focus is on public affairs and advocacy campaigns and media relations and crisis communications, which is what we'll be discussing with all of you today.
Hey, Josh.
Yes,
hey,
sir.
Josh, sorry to interrupt. Can you lean into your mic a little bit further?
Oh, of course. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. So some of the services that we offer, as we mentioned, media relations, media training, which we're doing today, crisis communications. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about media relations from kind of a very entry level, and then we're going to move up into kind of more specific things. But when we talk about the evolution of the news cycle, most people of a certain age will look back and remember, the neighborhood news delivery, or if you say the word news, you'll quite often think about the newspaper. Next slide, please. However, things started to change, as many of us will remember, in the 60s and 70s with evening news, network news. A major turning point in the news cycle was when CNN hit and the 24-hour news cycle became part of the normal everyday function of news. And it used to be when you had a newspaper reporter, they were able to get a story, they were able to report on it, and they had a significant amount of time before the news came out the next day. So you were always getting news that was, pretty much, a day behind in many cases. And even with TV news, where they had regular scheduled times, the timeline shifted quite a bit. But what really changed was in 1986 with CNN, and when we moved to a 24-hour news cycle, that changed everything for communicators, government professionals, businesses, anybody who's creating news, because they were going live with things as they happened. There wasn't any more delay, there wasn't any more lag. Another major shift, and we could go back even further to the advent of Facebook, but the reason I have TikTok up there and it may horrify all of you to hear this, but we share this statistic with everybody. 32% of adults between the ages of 18 and 29 use TikTok as their primary news source. That's a statistic from the Pew Research Foundation, and that number continues to grow every year, and it continues to grow across all demographics. So now news isn't even being filtered through a editorial newsroom. It's coming from individuals. They're posting stuff, and that's sparking the conversation. How do we consume information? This is kind of part and parcel to that last slide. The notion of focused ritual, right? Many people for many years would get up in the morning and go out to their driveway and get their print newspaper. I still get a print newspaper delivered to my house every day, but I also know that it's really old news. I've already checked online and seen, all the news coverage for that day. However, it still matters to me to know what are the most important stories? What are the layout editors at the newspaper considering the most important stories, and those things that are top of the fold? And where is that story placed there? Because it gives you insight into how the people in the newsroom are thinking about your news, if they deem it important. So if in a broadsheet, if it's above the fold, that's going to be more important than something on, C16 deep inside the paper. Infotainment has kind of blurred the lines between traditional hard news and more infotainment, and more people are getting confused when they watch, talk shows at night or read opinion columnists. The overall news IQ of the overall news consumer has gone down significantly over the years. And all you have to do is open any paper and read letters to the editor or listen to any talk news radio, and people will be complaining endlessly about opinion columns and how the newspaper is biased, when that's exactly what opinion columnists should do. And then, of course, now social media. Sharice, do you have anything to add? Because you've worked in the governor's office on the government side, about just in the time that you've been working professionally, your thoughts on the change in the news cycle.
Thanks, Josh. One stat that really stood out to me as we were preparing for this is, and this number is as of actually 2023, so the number might even be higher now, but comparing 2022 to 2023, the amount of time that we all have spent online increased more than 30% just from 2022 to 2023. So you can imagine all right, now we're looking at 2023 to 2024, that number I'm sure has increased even further. And I think that goes to Josh's point of how the news is evolving. We're getting our news different places, and a lot of it is online. And that gets to the importance of our relationships with reporters and how we are working with the media, which I know we're going to get into a little bit more in the coming slides.
So everybody knows the old 5 Ws, right? So when you think about you're a PIO, you're a comms director, you're a media relations professional for your county, you have to approach the news kind of like a journalist would, right? You want to approach the reporters with information, and you want to really prioritize it. So when you're sending out, and we do this in our own media advisories, if you have an event coming up, if you have an announcement, a groundbreaking, a press conference, whatever it'll be, we actually put these right into the media advisory. Who's going to be there? What are you doing? Where is it happening? When is it happening? And then why? We found that to be extremely successful, and it's stood the test of time. But of course, even the things that have stood the test of time also face changes in evolution. So also now we have the 3 Bs. Be first, be interesting, and be simple. And those are pretty self-explanatory, but being first is important, especially in a competitive environment. Right now at the state capitol, organizations like your own, like NYSAC, like the ones we represent, are all competing for a finite amount of attention with the journalists who cover such things. So being first to let them know about your event, your topic, your priorities is very important, because it has become increasingly competitive. People are getting much more savvy about dealing with the media. Being interesting is also important. When you're dealing with television broadcast news, their least favorite thing in the world are talking heads at a podium. That is not great for them. And if you talk to any TV news producer, they'll tell you first and foremost, they want good visuals. They want things that are actually useful. So I know sometimes there's nothing you can do about that. Like you're having a press conference, all you have are people speaking at the podium. But try to think of things that are visually interesting for television. Have some graphics on large 2x3 foot foam core that help illustrate what you're talking about. If at all possible, give them, if you have any graphics you can send to them in advance that, or with your press release that they can use in the news coverage. But remember, try to be interesting. And then lastly, be simple. Depending on the topic, and I know all of you work with subject matter experts that are experts in all types of things, you know, in how counties are funded and that mechanism, about the minutia of legislation, all these complicated things that your people are experts in, but the general public isn't. You remember, you're talking to a mass audience. You have to make it as simple and digestible as possible for the most possible people. So kind of summing up what we've said in the last few slides, we used to have to think like journalists, but again, evolution, now we kind of need to be journalists because newsrooms are shrinking across the country. Just the other day, the LA Times announced they're laying off 115 people. The new owner of the Baltimore Sun announced that they were planning to end print publication. Increasingly, we need to be journalists as communicators, and we need to create news. So I'll give you an example personally, and I think Sharice probably has something else as well. I was going to a press conference that we were doing years ago out in Utica, and I called all the local TV stations out there. I knew all the assignment editors, and they're like, yep, Josh, absolutely. We're covering it. We're sending a reporter. And I'm driving out along the thruway, and I'm about 10 to 15 miles outside of Utica, and I see all these lights, ambulances, fire trucks, police cars, and a huge accident going east on the thruway in the other lane. And my first thought was, oh gosh, I hope everybody's okay. But my second thought is, this is going to bump us. We're not going to get coverage. So before I could even call the news desks, I was getting calls from the assignment editors saying, Josh, we can't cover it. There's a big accident out in the thruway. I said, I know. I'm like, how about this? What if I shoot video of the event and I send you some clips? I send you some B-roll. I send you a couple of interviews, or you can get on Zoom and do an interview with one of my people after the fact. And they said, yeah, absolutely. And that was the first time that a newsroom, particularly television newsroom, had ever been adaptable enough to go for something like that. But now increasingly, they are more than happy to take video footage that you can provide, and they're more than happy to do Zoom interviews. So I encourage creativity and to both think like a journalist, but then sometimes put on that fedora and get out your notepad and be a journalist. Sharice, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask if we could go to the next slide because I think it's a good transition. You know, looking at relationship, loyalty, value, success, and again, tying back to the evolution of what we're all doing, right, as PIOs, as media relations professionals. And this gets to, and I don't know if you've all noticed yet, but we're big on acronyms. And there's another model that we like to follow called the PESO model. It's PESO. And this gets to that concept. It's paid media, earned media, shared media, and owned media. And what Josh just gave as an example is a perfect example of owned media, right? Like he had a situation and solved the problem. We recorded the press conference, got B-roll ourselves, and then included that in the press release to share with reporters. And by having those relationships with those reporters, and showing the value of what we bring, right, as media relations professionals, they know we're going to provide them with good quality content, video that they can easily download and turn around and use in their news report. And that's kind of the the beauty of what we're doing now in today's day and age. We really, like Josh said, we have to be the reporter and think just like them, and really, give them the news, hand it over on a silver platter, and do as much prep work as we can. And that's how we'll get coverage of what we're, what we're working towards.
So you just heard us say, think like reporters, be a reporter. And now we're going to tell you, but we still, why should we do interviews then if we can, create our own news? Because still to this day, when they judge trustworthiness of information, even though it's gone downhill from its heyday in the 70s and the kind of post-Watergate era, information that people receive through a news outlet still enjoys a greater level of trust than information they derive through social media. Even though we gave you a stat about people increasingly going to social media, when they judge trust, news is still the number one in terms of trust. And I think it's going to continue to be that way. I think as AI continues to evolve and go, you're going to see that people are going to, I think, migrate back to traditional news outlets because they know that there's somebody there who is beholden to a certain standard that news has been filtered through. So quick funny story. And usually when I do this presentation in person, we have some props that we like to show. And every client always says, I want to be in the New York Times. And we're like, well, that's great, but that's a heavy lift. That's not the easiest thing to do. And we explained the day that the iPhone, whatever number came out, Steve Jobs used to do this major press conference in his black turtleneck, and it was a huge thing and it got lots of coverage. Usually you would think that would get, top billing, like that would make front page of the New York Times. But just goes to show the day that they did their big announcement, they got bumped by the Anthony Weiner story. So it just goes to show sometimes being in the New York Times isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's not necessarily going to be for the reasons that you'd hope. So I always tell people, focus on your local news and go from there. If you have a good story, it'll eventually get to those bigger national outlets. So this is basic, and for any of you who already understand this, please bear with us, but for those who don't, we think it's always worth reminding. And this is really kind of the fundamentals of media relations. An incoming inquiry versus a pitched story. And anybody that's ever dealt with reporters or been in a media-facing role will understand this. This is reactive versus proactive. And incoming inquiries, as we say in the slides, are much more difficult to deal with because you have no idea what's coming and you are not always prepared for it. You have much less control. The best scenario to be in, where you really would like to be, is when you're pitching the news, because you can do all the things you need to do. You can get your messaging in line. You can get all of your speakers lined up and have them ready to go with their talking points. You can identify third-party validators, people that are not necessarily tied to the story, but that you can point a reporter to who's tight on time and is trying to turn this around as quickly as possible. And they're going to call and interview that person, but you've already teed that person up. And I can give you an example. It's not a specific example, but it's more of a made-up example that a county might face. So say you know that you're going to have a major investment. A company's opening a new facility in your county, whether it be a warehouse or a factory or even a new hotel. You have the time on your side to get all the things you need to make sure you get the best possible story. You write the press release, you get the quotes, you tee everybody up, you get some architectural renderings, maybe you plan a groundbreaking, but also you can talk to people, the developer who you're working with, and you can talk to other folks in the community, maybe the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and you can get all those interviews. Again, going back to thinking like a journalist, who are the other people they're going to want to hear from other than you, the PIO, or the county executive, or the chair of the county legislature? Who are those other people that they're going to want to hear from? And if you've already got those people lined up and ready to speak and they're on message, that is the best possible scenario and you'll get the best possible story. So whenever possible, we encourage our people we're talking to like this to be proactive and try and get in front of things. But of course, you can't always do that. There's always going to be, incoming stories. So if we could just move on to the next slide, we'll get into a little of those details of how you deal, what you do with a incoming inquiry. One thing we advise, and if you're new to this role or you're not, is never take a cold call. If you see a call coming in on your cell phone or your office line and it's not a number you recognize, I advise not to take it. And the reason is that if a reporter gets you on the phone, they're just going to launch into questions that you're potentially not prepared to ask. And if you haven't done this for a long time or you're new to it, that can be a little intimidating. And sometimes people will say things because we all have that inherent nature that we want to be truthful and transparent and we want to help people. So sometimes you'll say some things that you don't want to say. So much better to let it go to voicemail, and then you can either call them back, or when you've had time to get your facts together, or you can email them, even better, and just say, hey, I'm not available to talk right now. Could you let me know what your deadline is, what you're looking for? And if you could even send me over a couple of questions, that'd be great, because then I can go get the facts. And when we do talk, I can be more prepared to have that conversation. So that leads to the next point, ask questions. You are totally entitled to ask them, what's the story about? Where did it come from? Who else have you talked to? What are the facts you're looking for? You are absolutely within your right to ask those questions. And then once you have all that information, that's when you can go back, get your facts together and define your messages. Figure out, what am I going to say to this person and what am I not going to say? Those are really, that's really, really key. If you don't take away anything else from today's conversation, if you follow these rules, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble.
So for the do's and don'ts of interviewing, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, for the first check mark here, keeping your answers short. And that goes back to what Josh was talking about of keeping it simple, especially for TV. You might have a lengthy interview, a long conversation, whether it's in person or over Zoom, and they're only going to use 10 to maybe 20, 25 seconds of your discussion. And that's why it's so important to, ahead of time, do that preparation, know what your key messages are, practice them even in the mirror so you know what you look like, how you're conveying it, your facial expression, your body language. Really, practice makes perfect, right? That's something we've all heard for a long time, and it really rings true. So keeping it short, keeping it simple, and understanding that, the three legs of the stool truly are the story that you are connecting to your message, and often what reporters are interested in are the people first stories. So how does this impact the community, the people of the folks who are watching their station or reading their paper? Stats and data just, it can't be questioned. It's the best value that you can add to a story and support your message, right? And then again, those sound bites, you want them to be short and concise and to the point. The one thing that I like to recommend to folks is, understanding what your key message is. Like if you had to pick one message that you wanted to leave the reporter with, start with that and then bookend it and end with that. And that way it's in their mind when you wrap up the interview. It's the last thing that they remember talking with you about. And oftentimes the reporters will ask at the end of the interview, right? They'll ask, is there anything else that we didn't touch on today that you want our viewers to know, or is there anything else that you want to share with our readers? And that's a great opportunity to, again, circle back to your key messages in a nice short soundbite and end with that. I don't know, Josh, if there's anything you want to add there, but.
No, I think the next thing is a good example of, so you have to be aware, and this is kind of a 1-2, these next two slides. You have to be aware that no matter how good your interview is and how memorable your quotes are, oftentimes they might not make it into the story, and you've got to be prepared for that. but it doesn't mean it wasn't effective, right? So I'm sure we've all been there, or those of us who've been in these roles before, where you've spent a lot of time with the reporter and you may talk to them for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, shoot, an hour. And you might give them some great quotes that you think are really good. Like I think the quote we took from this interview that we listened, we were part of and we heard and we thought was a real whiz bang quote was, this is a big deal. If a kid isn't getting those services, then they're having trouble. They're not going to be able to participate in things like reading and writing. Like that is a good soundbite. That's a memorable quote. Like when a reporter hears that, it just rings in their head. This is a big deal. It's plain English. It resonates with people. It's how people actually talk, and it's kind of catchy and memorable. But then when you actually go to the next slide, you'll see the quote didn't make it into the story. And so you just have to be prepared with the fact that sometimes, no matter how great your interview is, no matter how good your quote is, things aren't always going to make it in. And it's best to go in knowing that, not to be upset when it doesn't happen, and just be prepared and understand that even best laid plans don't always necessarily work out. Next slide, please. So along those lines, the do's and don'ts of interviewing. So now you've gone through the process of either pitching the story, or you've got your, you've let the incoming inquiry go to voicemail. You've had the chance to figure out what the story's about. You've gone and gotten your facts lined up. You've written down some talking points for yourself, or maybe somebody in your organization who will be speaking, not you, but maybe it's, a director of a department or the county executive. Some really basic tips to make sure that the actual interview goes well. First and foremost, speak simply. Don't use a lot of jargon. We always joke about this, maybe because I work in the communications profession and train people, do media training. But whenever we see, and I'm going to pick on the firefighters because I know a lot of them and we're good friends. But whenever you see a firefighter interviewed on TV after a fire, I don't know why, but they always, use like firefighting jargon. They don't speak in plain English, and people tend to notice it. You'll see it sometimes on social media. People on some of the comments will even joke about it, and it just never, sounds. When we arrived, it was fully involved, and what does that even mean, fully involved? I mean, through context, we can understand. But I think that they do it because that's the language that they use every day, the technical language. But that's not language normal everyday people use. And there's things in writing and communications that will make people start to listen, and there's things that will make them stop listening. And as people's attention span gets shorter and shorter, you don't want to do anything that's going to make somebody stop. So, don't use a long and complicated word when a simpler word would do the job, and just really try and talk like you would normally talk with anybody in your family. And maybe that's how you talk. Maybe you're an astrophysicist and, speak in very complicated terms all the time, but do your best to try and modulate your tone for your audience. Do question facts. So a lot of times when you're in an interview situation, a reporter will give you something that they're stating as a fact. And if you're pretty sure that that might not be a fact, or they might say, well, I heard from blah, 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 that the county is going to do this. You can refute that. You should question that. You should say, well, where did they get that information? Where is that information coming from? Because that's not the information that I have. Don't allow a fact that you know to be incorrect to stand on the record. You should challenge that. This one's the most important. Do not discuss hypotheticals. Never deal with hypotheticals. A reporter will give you a hypothetical situation. Well, what if this happened, or what if somebody did that? The best answer you can give in every situation is, I don't deal with hypotheticals. We don't respond to hypothetical situations. We deal with facts, and the facts of this situation are X, Y, and Z. And we're going to get a little later to, actually in the next slide, to bridging statements, ways to get around that. And then the last one, and this is the basis of all communications and media relations, is don't lie, don't lie, don't lie, and don't bluff. Because if there's nothing worse than getting caught in a lie or called out in a lie, it erodes your credibility. You're trying to build relationships with these reporters, and it's impossible to come back from. It's very, very difficult. So be truthful. And if you don't, if you're asked a question that you can't respond to or don't want to respond to, don't say no comment. We're going to give you some ways to get out of that with a little thing called bridging statements. So Charisse, I imagine there were times when you were asked some questions that you were told going into the interview that you can't answer or you can't address. How were you, how did you manage to handle those tricky situations?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, that's happened a lot over the years. And it's a tough thing, to get used to. And I'll fall back on what I said before about practicing. Definitely want to practice bridging statements, because it's how you put your key messages forward and put, talking about what you're for. And there's a lot of examples that we're actually going to get to in the next slide or two. But you never want to repeat the reporter's question back. You want to just stick with what you're trying to advance. So, and you gave a good example before, but if they ask, here's an example. Was your coffee hot or cold this morning? It's a great question. The coffee was delicious, and I highly recommend going out and trying a cup of that coffee. I didn't address if it was hot, if it was cold. I said it was great. That was my key message at this point, right? That might not be the best example, but there's a lot of great ways to bridge a reporter's question with your response. And sometimes you'll work with reporters where they'll just keep asking the same question a different way. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with you repeating the same answer, because at the end of the day, the reporter can only use what you give them. And we're going to get into a couple of more examples in the next couple slides.
So bridging statements are really important because you are going to be in these situations and you are going to be faced with, even in the best case scenario, so you've not answered the phone, you let it go to voicemail, you emailed the reporter back and asked some questions, when they're on deadline, what they want, what their questions are going to be, what your facts are and how you're going to answer them. Some reporters, and in the old days, it was most, would insist, I really need to get on the phone with you to get a quote. My outlet, my newspaper, my TV station won't take a written statement. Like we have to do an interview. And then you have to judge whether or not that outlet's important enough to you that you're risking, harming your relationship with them. And I would say if you're particularly dealing with a local news, right? So and I assume most county PIOs are going to be dealing with their local county news outlets. So those are relationships I think you're going to really need to build and nurture and maintain. So if they insist on a phone call or an in-person interview, then I would advise doing that, because ultimately you want to develop that relationship. So that's why if you're ever forced into that situation and you have to answer a difficult question, there are ways around that. And we're going to give you a whole bunch of different types of words that we can use in little sentences, and you can actually write them down because they're, eventually you'll memorize them. But like Charisse said, it allows you to move away. So in situations where you have a tough question, yes or no is probably the best scenario, because then you're not adding more than you need. But sometimes you have to go a little bit deeper. They'll ask a follow-up question. I mean, we've all seen presidential debates where they double that. The moderator will ask a follow-up question to really try and get an answer to something. And that's where you use those bridging statements. So you'll see the example here, perhaps is one of them. And then it gives you a little bit of time and a little bit of wiggle room to move to the safe place where you ultimately want to be. Next slide, please. So here are some examples that we think are quite effective, right? So if someone asks you a question and there are ways you can move around it. And you can say things like, you know, let me emphasize again, or if they ask you a question, I think it would be more accurate or correct to say, and then move into an area of safe space. It's just a way to kind of fill the air, begin to answer your question. And if you're on in person, it's even harder because you have to think on your feet. And this gives you that 1 or 1.5 seconds to think about, where am I going to go? What are my talking points? What's my safe space, right? Where can I move to? And that's about preparation. If you've done your job and you've written down or developed your talking points that you were prepared to talk about going into the interview, you can use these statements to give yourself a second and just kind of reset yourself and move back to. Another one I like is, you know, that's a great question, but I think the better question is, and you're basically setting up the question that you wanted to answer, not the question that they were asking you. So these are helpful. You'll find the one that fits best for you in the situation. And I always advise, pick 1 or 2 that you really like and just keep those in your back pocket and you know, practice with them. It sounds a little silly, but actually practice with them, because you'll just get more comfortable doing that, and have somebody in your office, one of your colleagues, your spouse, ask you some like tough questions. The famous example was a presidential candidate getting asked the question, when was the last time you beat your wife? And he said, I beat my wife, like in stunned, you know, response. Well, that was not the right answer. He should have taken a second, you know, used a bridging statement, thought about where he wanted to go, and move away into a better direction. All right, telephone interviewing tips. This is, most of the time, I think you're going to find yourself doing a lot of telephone interviews. It's still kind of the easiest way, even though everybody's moved to text. A couple of things we advise, and we think that it's, oh, I think I skipped over one, my apologies. We'll do telephone, then we'll go back to face-to-face. My apologies. Telephone interviews, you know, this is going to sound a little bit silly, but you want to stand up. It's weird, but you sound different when you stand up as opposed to sitting down. You might be surprised, but I actually stood up for a lot of this when we were giving this presentation. It helps your body. I think it helps you focus. It works for some people, not for others, but give it a try sometime. You'll be surprised. Using speakerphone, that can be real tricky. It picks up background noise. It can be hard. We advise, whenever possible, use a landline. You know, cell phones cut in and out. It's just, I know it's not always possible, but it's a good idea. And then really try to have a calm, clear, like reasonable cadence. Don't speak so fast that people can't understand you. Don't speak so slowly that you sound like a robot. Just try and talk in a like regular, normal voice, and try to project that you're calm and you're confident and that you have a good command of the topic. So face-to-face interviewing tips. When you're doing, whether it be face-to-face with a print reporter or a radio reporter or a television reporter, which can be tricky when you have the camera lens and light in your face, these are even harder because you're on the spot, right? You can't really have your notes in front of you as well. It's a little bit, the stakes are a little higher. So that's why we always say be prepared. As much as possible, have your facts, know what you're going to say, focus on your talking points, and remember where your comfortable spots are, but also remember your bridging statements if you get in a tough spot. Be relaxed and have good body language. At the end of the day, if you're standing there and you're very stiff and you're sweating and you're red in the face, people read into that. They're going to feel like that person must be hiding something. That person must be, you know, uncomfortable for some reason. It's hard, and again, it's something that takes practice. When we do like media trainings with clients, we actually do that. We put them on camera. We get the full, you know, TV camera, tripod, the bright light. It's in your face. There's a microphone in your face, and we ask you questions. And we'll ask you a series of questions related to a topic, but then we throw some curveballs at you because that can happen. and it gives you practice for dealing with those unexpected questions. And the last one isn't necessarily just related to face-to-face interviewing tips. It's related to kind of all interviews. Don't go off the record. We advise most 99.9% of people not to do this, because in order to go off the record by the rules of journalism, you have to say to the reporter, I'd like to go off the record. Most of the time, the reporter is going to say to you, why do you want to go off the record? But you're not off the record until the reporter says, okay, we're off the record. It has to be a verbal agreement between both parties. Otherwise, you're not off the record. So just please, please, please remember that. I've seen clients do it so many times. And really, I only advise doing this after you've developed a very, very, very strong and working relationship with a reporter who you know and trust, because it's just a dangerous proposition. And quite often when people think or just say they're going off the record, that's when they say some really unguarded things that get them into hot water. So actually the segue is nice into television interviewing tips. Talking sound bites, television is even shorter than print or radio. They're going to want very, very quick sound bites. And like we said, you might interview for 20 or 30 minutes, which is really uncommon, probably more like 5 or 10 minutes, and they're going to use 6 or 7 seconds. So remember the points you want to get across, do your best to get them into sound bites, and make sure that you're delivering those sound bites.
And I'll add 2 things here too, if I can jump in. For the telephone interviewing, a good rule of thumb too is, you can have bulleted out your key points right in front of you, and that's encouraged. Because if you're not on camera and you can have those points to fall back on to make you more comfortable while you're talking to the reporter over the phone, that just makes you more comfortable, and that'll come across in your tone and your voice, like Josh mentioned. And also you have the facts in front of you, so you can't mix up any numbers, you can't mix up dates. You've got it right there in front of you. And also with television interviewing, we saw during the pandemic, and really this concept hasn't gone away, but if you can't do in person for television interviews, there is the option of Zoom or Skype, and some reporters still use that tactic. So again, similar to telephone interviews, if it's a Zoom interview for television, we encourage you to have, you can pull up a Word document right on your screen, have that right below the camera so that folks, who are watching TV later that night, they can't see you looking around at different parts of the screen, right? Have a Word document with a couple key points right underneath your camera on your screen, and that gives you something to fall back on. The other thing that you can do is just write a couple things on Post-it notes and have them right on your screen next to the camera on either side. That way it's not in view, doesn't cover the camera lens, but it's still right where your eyes should be looking at the camera, and allows you to, again, fall back in your key messages and stay on point.
Yeah, and just one last thing on those Zoom interviews. We've all seen the TV interview where the guy's kid comes into the room and the mom goes in and grabs the kid. Be mindful of that. If you're doing a Zoom interview, try to find a quiet space where you're not going to be interrupted. We always remind people, shut your phone off. It's basic, but it happens. You don't want your phone ringing and have that funny ringtone, going off while you're in an interview. Just kind of basic things, but they're good to remember. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to move through these next few slides pretty quickly. We like to advocate we have a philosophy that we follow regarding communications. We use this philosophy called ALS, affirmative, layered, and sustained communications. And we believe that that's effective, and Teresa is going to get into that a little bit in a second. But it's very important, and we think it really kind of underpins our philosophy toward media relations and communications. And we found our clients and partners found it useful too. Next slide, please.
So when we're talking about affirmative, layered, and sustained, affirmative meaning saying what we're for rather than what we're against. And I'll use the example that Josh brought up earlier in our presentation. So if a new company's come into the area, investing in the area, what are we for? We are for investments in our community. We are, talking about the positives rather than any negatives that might be coming up. And this actually goes back to some of the interview points that we made earlier. If there is someone out there, a group advocate, somebody who is bringing up a counterpoint, you never want to repeat the counterpoint because you don't want to give them any air in the room. So always saying what you are for, falling back to those key messages, and then layered. And when we say layered, this means saying that message a number of different times, a number of different ways, over a number of different platforms. So that kind of ties into the PESO model we talked about earlier, the paid, earned, owned, and shared kinds of media. So if we want to layer our message, we want to put it on our organization's social media page. We want to include it in news releases, statements, when we're talking with the press. If there is, a specific like membership interactive, whether it's e-newsletter or community forum, we want to include it there. So layering your message a number of different ways and then sustained, continuing that effort over time. And that's how we can break through the noise and ensure that our message is getting to the folks that we are targeting, our target audiences, and it's coming across and we're being successful in our campaign. Next slide.
So the next few things are really just reiterating, and we'll move through those in like a minute because we want to allow some time for questions. We always advise people, do no harm. They can only use what you give them, right? So be mindful of that. The quotes you provide are what they can use. So be mindful of that and seize the day. You've got to move quickly. You've got to be active because the news cycle is fickle. It moves on. So you have to really move as quickly as you can. If an editorial comes out that is negative about you or your organization, and you want to respond with an opinion piece, an op-ed, you don't have a month. You've got days, not weeks or months. So be quick about that. Next slide, please. So as Sheree said, affirmative messages, say what you're for rather than what you're against. We can move down to layering. 2 more slides, please. 1 more, please. Think of all the different ways that you can get your message out there. There's a lot of different things from news releases, direct mail still exists. I get it in my mailbox every day. Advocacy events, special events, opinion pieces, social media, and then sustained. The next slide, please. You just have to do it over and over again. People talk about lightning is a big flash and everybody looks at it and it gets a lot of attention, but it's only for a split second. But waves on the beach can change the contours of continents. So think of your communication strategy more like waves on the beach than a flash of lightning. Next slide, please. Making news. Again, we've talked about all this stuff. Localizing a national story, it's got to be timely. Journalists are looking for reporting the score, metrics, magnitude. Are you the first? Are you the biggest? And then trends, counter trends. Again, tying back to thinking like a journalist. These are just the tools you can use if you've never been a journalist or studied journalism. Those are the things that journalists are going to be looking for. In more face-to-face meetings, we would do this next slide, time to practice, but we'll just jump right over that into questions. We've still got 4 or 5 minutes left. We'll share Sharice's contact with you as well.
All right, thanks so much, Josh and Sharice. Now I'll take a few questions. So if you have a question, please enter it into the questions panel. We did have one come in from a PIO. It says, we are often challenged when the media takes statements made at meetings and turn them into a story out of context to make the county look bad. As the PIO, I'm often asked to address a statement to the media about the inaccurate statements. This has turned into a dialogue. The media says we are covering up things by doubling back and not sticking to our story. So do you have any suggestions of how to handle this kind of situation where the media is taking statements made from, I assume, a public meeting and then asking the county PIO to respond to them when they're not necessarily accurate to begin with, and avoiding looking like you're trying to cover something up?
No, the way I would characterize it is I would say, do you watch any presidential press briefings after a presidential statement? There's nothing wrong with clarifying something. sometimes things, you know, we're all imperfect beings, right? So when the county executive or a member of the county legislature says something in public, you have every right to clarify that after the fact. And it's not covering anything up. It's just that the context of the situation and what the person said may not have been, you know, in full context. You didn't have all the information. And so we had the opportunity, based on the reaction, to go back and clarify those points and be more specific. So it wasn't a perfect scenario where they could have a back and forth conversation and say, did I understand that correctly? Could I follow up on that? Sometimes it was just a one question, one answer. And that's the way I would characterize it, is, again, if you've developed that relationship with the reporter, and hopefully you do, you can go back and clarify that. Your thoughts, Sharice? You've been in these situations many times.
Yeah, I think the, you know, if there's any way to tie in, and we spoke about data a little bit during our presentation, if there's any way to tie in facts, data, you know, surveys, research that you can point to that clarifies whatever was said, that's always, at least I think, the best way to go, because you really can't argue with, you know, data and research that's out there. So if there's any way to fall back on that, that would be the recommendation. Otherwise, definitely agree with what Josh said.
I've got a couple of questions that I'll try to merge into one bigger one here. And with the notion of, like, if we have a local reporter who has a history of not being fair to the county, how can we get our own message out to our residents? And my first thought as a communications person would be social media is one main avenue. And that circles back to one of your earlier points about TikTok being, you know, having this huge influence on at least one particular set of demographics. But TikTok is also banned by numerous counties across the state. So the second part of that question is, you know, are we missing out by not having access to that audience, and or what is the best social media platforms that a county can focus on?
So I'll jump in. I think, you know, Facebook, the demographics of Facebook are probably like your biggest voter base too, and active residents. So that's like your 55 and up. And I would think utilizing groups, public pages, and being active in those different communities is a great way to go. You know, realizing that TikTok is definitely like the younger demographics, and we do want to get in front of them as they're, you know, coming of age and getting more engaged in the community. But there's also, you know, third-party validators that you can fall back on, and we talked a little bit about that earlier. Engaging with your community partners who understand, you know, each of the specific situations that you're dealing with or that you're partnering on with different projects, and have them speak to what's happening in the local community that's being supported by your local government. Josh and I and the whole team here at CPC, we really like to focus on third-party validators, because it's just another voice that maybe a different community member can relate to that underscores your key message.
All right, and we've got one, this may be a tough one, but a question about recommendations for having a centralized comms process. How can a county implement a process for making sure news coverage and press releases and social media posts get funneled through county leadership?
Just a clarifying question, if I may. When they say through county leadership, do they mean funnel everything through the comms director, the PIO, or does that mean everything has to get approved by the county executive and the senior cabinet team?
I assume the latter, but I don't know for sure.
I will say the latter is going to be extremely challenging. In news, you have to be quick. You have to, you know, you don't have a lot of time to respond. And we find a lot of times when you need we call it a decision tree, right? So you need to identify the, like, maybe 3 max. That's your maximum number of people who get to decide on a response. It can't be 8 people. It can't be 10 people. So it might be the county executive and maybe their chief of staff and the comms director. But, like, that's fine. But you also need to put on paper in your plan, your decision tree plan, like, we will respond to this within 24 hours. Like, you need buy-in from those people that it's a priority, because you do have a limited amount of time, and you can't keep reporters waiting forever. They're going to publish with or without you, and then you're going to be mad because you didn't get your side of the story in. So my advice would be, and you can find examples of them out there. Find this, I think it came from military PIOs. There's a decision tree. A thing comes in, this is how it gets handled. They agree it's a priority, so they're going to address it, and the clock's ticking. You have a certain amount of time to respond, but limit that number. You can't have 1 million people involved with it. And sometimes it helps to have, and I'm not trying to like sell our services, you can find anybody, but go find somebody that doesn't work for your county executive. It's easier for us to tell them like, hey, this is best practices. You're going to be in trouble if you don't do this, than it is. And I've been in those situations where I worked in-house. Sometimes it's hard to, to tell somebody these difficult things. So, and sometimes it's hard to tell them they're not good on camera and that they need some media training.
Well, I think that is a good place to end it. That is all I have for questions, and we are a little bit over time. So thank you again, Josh and Cerise, for taking some time to provide this training. I know I learned a lot. I've sat through a few of these over the years since I started with NYSAC, but it's always nice to have a reminder. I always see things that's like, oh yes, I have to remember that next time. Next time I get a cold call from a reporter. Just a reminder to everybody that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website, nysac.org/webinars, where you can also find the slide deck PDF to download. So thank you again, and that will conclude today's webinar.
Thanks so much.